In the twilight of the Italian Renaissance, when Florence still dreamed of its republican glory and the Italian peninsula lay fractured under foreign boots, there lived a man whose name would become synonymous with cunning, deception, and ruthless political calculation: Niccolò Machiavelli. For over 5 centuries, his name has been invoked as a curse, whispered as a warning, and wielded as an accusation against anyone perceived to place power above principle. To call someone Machiavellian is to suggest they are amoral, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice any scruple for advantage. Yet this caricature, this monstrous reputation, obscures one of history's most penetrating minds and most misunderstood philosophers. Who was the real Machiavelli? Not the devil in human form that popular imagination has constructed, but the actual man who lived, suffered, hoped, and wrote during one of history's most turbulent periods. To understand his philosophy, we must first understand the context that produced it. A world of constant war, political betrayal, religious hypocrisy, and foreign domination that made survival itself a philosophical question. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence on May 3, 1469, into a family of modest means, but respectable lineage. His father, Bernardo, was a lawyer of limited success, and the family struggled financially throughout Niccolò's youth. This early experience of precariousness, of living on the edge between respectability and poverty, would shape his understanding of how fortune could elevate or destroy individuals and states alike. He received a humanist education, studying Latin and reading the classical authors, Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, who would profoundly influence his political thought. But unlike many humanists of his era who retreated into scholarly contemplation, Machiavelli would spend most of his career in the brutal arena of practical politics. In 1498, at the age of 29, Machiavelli entered the service of the Florentine Republic as second chancellor and secretary to the Ten of War. This position thrust him into the center of Florentine diplomacy and military affairs during one of the most dangerous periods in the city's history. For 14 years, he served the Republic with extraordinary dedication, undertaking diplomatic missions to France, the Holy Roman Empire, and various Italian states. He negotiated with kings, popes, and princes. He observed Cesare Borgia's brutal consolidation of power in the Romagna. He organized Florence's militia and directed its military operations. He saw firsthand and repeatedly how power actually operated, not according to the idealized principles taught by philosophers and theologians, but according to the harsh logic of force, deception, and self-interest. These were not abstract observations made from a comfortable distance. Machiavelli lived through the catastrophic French invasions of Italy that began in 1494, invasions that demonstrated with devastating clarity the military and political weakness of the Italian states. He witnessed the rise and fall of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who briefly turned Florence into a theocratic republic before being burned at the stake. He saw how the great powers of Europe, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire treated Italy as a battlefield for their ambitions, with Italian cities and their populations as mere pawns. He observed the corruption and worldly ambition of the Renaissance papacy, which commanded spiritual authority while pursuing temporal power with methods indistinguishable from secular princes. He watched as Florence's republican institutions, which he served with genuine devotion, proved inadequate to protect the city from external threats and internal divisions. Then, in 1512, catastrophe struck both Florence and Machiavelli personally. The Spanish army, allied with Pope Julius II, defeated Florence and restored the Medici family to power, ending the republic that Machiavelli had served. As a known Republican and servant of the previous government, Machiavelli was dismissed from office. Worse, in 1513, he was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy against the Medici, imprisoned and tortured. Though he was eventually released and retired to his small farm outside Florence, his career was finished. At 43 years old, this man who had negotiated with kings and directed armies found himself reduced to poverty, obscurity, and forced idleness. It was during this bitter exile from public life that Machiavelli composed his most famous works. Desperate to regain employment and relevance, he wrote The Prince in 1530 and dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, hoping it might serve as his ticket back to political office. He also began work on his discourses on Livy, a longer and, in many ways, more profound examination of republican government and Roman history. He wrote plays, poetry, and a history of Florence. He corresponded with friends, pouring out his frustration at being excluded from the political arena he loved. In a famous letter to Francesco Vettori, he described his daily routine, spending his days among peasants at the local inn, then returning home in the evening to don his finest clothes and enter his study, where he conversed with the ancient authors and wrote about politics. I am wasted in this way, he wrote, and a long time cannot pass before poverty makes me contemptible. This personal context is crucial for understanding Machiavelli's philosophy. He was not an armchair philosopher spinning theories for intellectual amusement. He was a man who had lost everything: his career, his income, his status, his purpose, because of political upheaval. He was desperate to return to public service, the only life that gave him meaning. His writings emerge from this combination of extensive practical experience and bitter exclusion, mixing intimate knowledge of how politics actually worked with the resentment and urgency of someone trying to prove his continued relevance. This helps explain both the brutal realism of his analysis and the shocking directness of his prescriptions. He had no patience for comfortable illusions because illusions had not saved Florence from disaster. But we must also understand the intellectual tradition against which Machiavelli was reacting. Medieval and Renaissance political philosophy had been dominated by what we might call the moralistic or mirror of princes tradition. This tradition, exemplified by works like Aquinas's political writings or Erasmus's Education of a Christian Prince, assumed that politics should be governed by the same moral principles that applied to private life. Princes were counseled to be virtuous, just, merciful, and honest. Political success was understood to flow from moral excellence. The ideal ruler was one who combined political power with ethical perfection, using his authority to promote Christian virtue and the common good. Political philosophy was essentially a branch of ethics, concerned with how rulers ought to behave according to eternal moral principles. Machiavelli rejected this entire framework with revolutionary force. He was not interested in how princes ought to behave according to moral ideals. He was interested in how they must behave to achieve and maintain power in the actual world, a world of deceit, violence, and self-interest. He did not believe that political success flowed from moral virtue. In fact, he argued that conventional morality often led to political disaster, while strategic immorality often led to political success. He separated political analysis from moral evaluation, treating politics as an autonomous realm with its own logic and requirements. This separation, this refusal to subordinate political analysis to moral prescription, represents Machiavelli's most revolutionary and controversial contribution to political philosophy. Yet this does not make Machiavelli the amoral monster of popular imagination. His writings reveal a man who loved Florence deeply, who admired republican government and political freedom, who celebrated civic virtue and patriotic devotion. He was not indifferent to morality, but deeply concerned with the specific morality required for political success. A morality that sometimes contradicted conventional Christian ethics, but served what he saw as higher political goods, like security, liberty, and greatness. His philosophy emerged from a profound tension between his republican ideals and his realistic assessment of what those ideals required for their realization. He wanted Florence to be free, but he recognized that freedom required power, and power sometimes required actions that conventional morality condemned. This tension animates all of Machiavelli's work and makes him endlessly fascinating. He was simultaneously a republican and an advocate for princely power, a moralist and a teacher of immorality, an idealist and a brutal realist. These contradictions were not intellectual failures, but reflections of the genuine dilemmas facing anyone who cares about political outcomes in an imperfect world. How can good people achieve political success when their opponents have no scruples? How can republics survive when surrounded by aggressive monarchies? How can political communities pursue justice without first securing the power necessary to defend themselves? How can leaders serve the common good when serving it sometimes requires acting against conventional notions of goodness? These questions remain as urgent today as they were in Machiavelli's time. We still struggle with the relationship between morality and political effectiveness. We still debate whether leaders should be judged by their intentions or their results. We still wonder whether democratic values can survive in a world where authoritarian powers play by different rules. We still grapple with the tension between idealistic principles and harsh realities. This is why Machiavelli continues to provoke, disturb, and enlighten us more than 5 centuries after he wrote. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about politics and human nature that we would prefer to ignore. What you are about to explore is not merely a historical curiosity or an exercise in understanding a controversial thinker. It is an examination of political philosophy's most fundamental questions through the eyes of one of its most penetrating and unsettling minds. Machiavelli offers no comfortable reassurances or easy answers. He demands that we look unflinchingly at how political power actually operates, not how we wish it would operate. He insists that we recognize the costs and moral compromises that political action sometimes requires. He challenges us to think clearly about politics without the consoling illusions that most political philosophy offers. Prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most misunderstood and most relevant political minds. The history of political philosophy can be divided into 2 periods, before Machiavelli and after Machiavelli. This division marks not merely a chronological distinction, but a fundamental rupture in how political phenomena are understood and analyzed. Machiavelli's revolutionary contribution was to separate political analysis from moral evaluation, to treat politics as an autonomous domain governed by its own logic rather than as a branch of ethics or theology. This separation, which seems almost obvious to modern readers, represented an intellectual earthquake that shattered centuries of accumulated wisdom about how political life should be understood. To grasp the magnitude of this break, we must understand the tradition Machiavelli was rejecting. From ancient Greece, through medieval Christendom, and into the Renaissance, political philosophy had assumed that politics should be subordinated to moral philosophy. Plato's Republic sought to define the just state based on eternal forms, accessible through philosophical contemplation. Aristotle analyzed politics as an extension of ethics, arguing that the polis existed to enable human flourishing and virtuous living. Augustine and Aquinas integrated political thought into Christian theology, arguing that earthly political authority derived its legitimacy from divine law and should serve spiritual ends. Renaissance humanists like Erasmus counseled princes to embody Christian virtues and pursue moral excellence in their rule. All of these approaches, despite their differences, shared a fundamental assumption: political life should be understood and evaluated according to timeless moral or theological principles. The proper starting point for political analysis was the question, how should rulers behave, or What makes a political order just? The goal was to align political practice with ethical ideals derived from philosophy, religion, or natural law. Political success was understood to flow from moral virtue. Just rulers would prosper, while unjust rulers would eventually face divine punishment or popular rebellion. The relationship between politics and morality was hierarchical, with moral principles standing above and judging political actions. He was not interested in the imaginary states described by philosophers, but in the effectual truth of the matter, rather than the imagination of it. He famously declared in The Prince that a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. This is not a lament about the world's imperfection, but a factual observation about how political reality actually operates. Machiavelli demolished this entire edifice with calculated precision. His revolutionary move was to begin not with the question of how rulers should behave, but with the question of how they must behave to achieve and maintain power. The key move here is subtle but profound. Machiavelli did not deny that moral principles exist or that they have value in private life. He did not claim that cruelty is good or that honesty is bad. He simply observed that in political life, the standards of conventional morality often lead to disaster, while violations of those standards often lead to success. A prince who keeps all his promises will be destroyed by rivals who break theirs strategically. A ruler who refuses to use violence will be overthrown by those willing to employ it. A state that conducts foreign policy according to moral principles will be conquered by states that prioritize power and advantage. This is not how things should be. It is simply how they are. This observation forced a radical reconceptualization of political analysis. If conventional morality does not reliably lead to political success, and if violations of conventional morality sometimes serve important political goods like security and stability, then we cannot evaluate political actions using the same moral framework we apply to private life. Politics requires its own ethical framework, one that takes seriously the specific requirements and dilemmas of wielding power. Machiavelli did not advocate immorality for its own sake. He advocated political effectiveness and argued that effectiveness sometimes requires actions that conventional morality condemns. Consider Machiavelli's famous discussion of whether it is better for a prince to be loved or feared. The conventional Christian answer would emphasize love. Rulers should govern through benevolence and inspire affection from their subjects. But Machiavelli analyzes the question purely in terms of political effectiveness. He concludes that while it would be ideal to be both loved and feared, when the two conflict, fear is more reliable than love. Why? Because love is preserved by the link of obligation which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails. This is not an expression of cynicism, but an accurate observation about human nature under political conditions. People's affections are fickle and self-interested, while their fears are constant and predictable. Notice what Machiavelli has done here. He has translated a moral question, is it better to be loved or feared, into a purely technical question about effective governance. The answer depends not on eternal moral principles, but on practical considerations about what achieves political stability. The moral framework has been set aside in favor of a consequentialist analysis focused solely on outcomes. This is the essence of Machiavelli's revolutionary break, treating political questions as technical problems of statecraft rather than as branches of ethics. This approach reaches its most shocking expression in Machiavelli's discussions of when rulers should break their promises, employ violence, or engage in deception. He does not frame these as moral dilemmas, but as strategic calculations. A prince must learn how not to be good and to use this or not to use it according to necessity. He should keep faith, when to keep it is to your advantage, and when the reasons that made you promise it no longer exist. He must be a great pretender and dissembler, because men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. These prescriptions have shocked readers for 5 centuries, and they continue to shock today. They seem to give license to any atrocity, to destroy any basis for trust or moral constraint in political life. But we must understand what Machiavelli is actually saying. He is not claiming that rulers should always lie or that violence should be employed indiscriminately. He is arguing that political leaders must be willing to violate conventional moral rules when doing so serves important political goods, particularly the security and stability of the state. The key phrase is, according to necessity. Machiavelli's prince is not a psychopath who delights in cruelty, but a strategic actor who recognizes that political responsibility sometimes requires morally problematic actions. This introduces a crucial distinction that runs throughout Machiavelli's work, the distinction between private morality and political morality. As private individuals, we can afford to be scrupulously honest, consistently merciful, and absolutely faithful to our promises, because our actions affect primarily ourselves and those immediately around us. But political leaders bear responsibility for the security and welfare of entire communities. Their failures can lead to conquest, oppression, or civic collapse, affecting thousands or millions of people. This responsibility creates moral obligations that sometimes conflict with conventional virtues. A ruler who refuses to authorize a strategic act of cruelty might cause the death of thousands through weakness. A leader who keeps every promise might enable enemies to destroy the state. In these situations, Machiavelli argues, the higher moral obligation is to the security and well-being of the political community, even if serving that obligation requires violating conventional moral rules. This is not relativism or nihilism. Machiavelli has not abandoned moral evaluation. He has redefined it for the political realm. Political leaders should be judged not by whether they conform to the moral standards appropriate for private life, but by whether they successfully fulfill their primary obligation, preserving and strengthening their state. A prince who rules with consistent virtue but loses his state to foreign conquest has failed morally, even if he maintained his personal innocence. A prince who employs strategic cruelty but preserves his state's independence has succeeded morally, even if he violated conventional ethical rules. The moral framework has shifted from individual virtue to collective consequences. This shift had revolutionary implications that reverberated through political philosophy. Machiavelli had effectively founded political science as an autonomous discipline, separate from moral philosophy and theology. He had established that political phenomena have their own internal logic that can be studied empirically without constant reference to normative ideals. He had demonstrated that political analysis must begin with how things actually are rather than how we wish they were. He had shown that political leaders face moral dilemmas that cannot be resolved through simple application of conventional ethical principles. The influence of this break cannot be overstated. Thomas Hobbes would develop a mechanistic theory of politics based on self-interest and power. Montesquieu would analyze political institutions in terms of their actual effects rather than their conformity to abstract ideals. The American founders would design constitutional structures based on realistic assumptions about human ambition rather than hopeful expectations of virtue. Modern political science would emerge as an empirical discipline, studying power, institutions, and behavior, rather than prescribing ideal forms. All of these developments trace their lineage back to Machiavelli's fundamental insight: politics must be understood on its own terms. Yet this revolutionary break created problems that continue to haunt political philosophy. If politics is separated from conventional morality, what prevents it from degenerating into pure power struggle with no ethical constraints whatsoever? If political leaders are permitted to violate moral rules according to necessity, who determines what counts as necessity? If we judge rulers by their results rather than their methods, do we not license any atrocity that happens to succeed? If political science becomes purely descriptive, studying how power operates without prescribing how it should be used, does it not become merely a handbook for tyrants? These concerns are legitimate, and Machiavelli's answers to them remain controversial. But we must recognize that he was not trying to destroy morality or celebrate evil. He was trying to think honestly about the genuine moral dilemmas that political responsibility creates, dilemmas that conventional moral philosophy had avoided by assuming that virtue and success necessarily coincide. He was forcing political philosophy to confront an uncomfortable reality. The political leaders sometimes face situations where all available options involve moral costs, where choosing the conventionally moral action leads to terrible consequences, where the requirements of political responsibility conflict with the requirements of individual conscience. This is Machiavelli's legacy. Not a handbook for tyrants, but a set of questions that cannot be avoided by anyone who thinks seriously about politics. How should we evaluate political leaders? By their intentions or their results? What moral constraints, if any, should limit the pursuit of political goals? Can political communities survive if their leaders observe the same moral standards appropriate for private life? What do political leaders owe to their communities, and what sacrifices can that obligation justify? These questions remain as urgent and unresolved today as they were in Machiavelli's time. At the heart of Machiavelli's political philosophy lies a conceptual pair that structures his entire worldview: fortuna and virtue. These Italian terms have no perfect English equivalents, and understanding what Machiavelli means by them is essential for grasping his revolutionary vision of political life. Fortuna refers to the role of chance, luck, and circumstances beyond human control in shaping political outcomes. Virtue refers to the qualities that enable a political leader to master fortune and impose order on chaos. The relationship between these two forces, the dance between what we can control and what controls us, defines the fundamental drama of political existence. Machiavelli's conception of fortuna drew on classical and Renaissance traditions, but transformed them for political purposes. In classical thought, fortune was often personified as a goddess who distributed good and bad outcomes capriciously without regard to human merit. Medieval Christianity had partially tamed this pagan concept by subordinating fortune to divine providence. What seemed like random chance was actually part of God's inscrutable plan. Renaissance humanists generally encouraged acceptance of fortune's role while counseling moderation and philosophical detachment. Machiavelli rejected all of these approaches as inadequate for political life. He did not deny fortune's power. Indeed, he acknowledged that fortune is the arbiter of half of our actions. But he insisted that the other half remains under human control, and it is this controllable half that distinguishes successful political actors from failures. More importantly, he argued that virtue could actually minimize fortune's domain, reducing the role of chance through strategic action, careful preparation, and bold intervention. Fortune was not an inscrutable goddess to be placated through prayer or accepted with philosophical resignation. Fortune was an adversary to be mastered through human capability. This leads to one of Machiavelli's most famous and disturbing images. Fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. And it can be seen that she lets herself be overcome by the bold, rather than by those who proceed coldly. And therefore, like a woman, she is always a friend to the young, because they are less cautious, more aggressive, and command her with greater audacity. This passage has rightfully been criticized for its misogynistic imagery, but we should not let our distaste for the metaphor blind us to the philosophical point. Machiavelli is arguing that fortune favors the aggressive and decisive over the cautious and deliberative. She yields to bold action rather than careful planning. She respects strength and determination more than wisdom and virtue in the conventional sense. This conception of fortune has profound implications for how political action should be understood. In the medieval Christian framework, political success or failure could be attributed to God's will. If a righteous king lost his throne, this was divine punishment for his sins or a test of his faith. In the classical philosophical framework, political success should flow from wisdom and moral virtue. The just king would prosper, while the tyrant would eventually fall. But Machiavelli's framework removes these comforting explanations. Political success depends partly on factors beyond anyone's control, fortune, and partly on specific human qualities, virtue, that have little to do with conventional morality or philosophical wisdom. So what is virtue? This is where translation becomes treacherous, because the English virtue carries strong moral connotations that Machiavelli's virtue deliberately avoids. For Machiavelli, virtue refers to the qualities that enable a political leader to achieve success, whatever those qualities happen to be. Sometimes a virtue involves conventional virtues like courage, wisdom, and justice. But sometimes it requires what conventional morality would call vices, cruelty, deception, ruthlessness, and treachery. Virtue is not fixed moral excellence but flexible capability, the capacity to do whatever the situation requires. Machiavelli describes Viet through his examples of successful political actors, particularly Cesare Borgia, whom he observed firsthand during his diplomatic missions. Borgia exemplified virtue by his ability to act decisively, to employ violence strategically, to inspire fear and loyalty simultaneously, to adapt his methods to changing circumstances, and to pursue his goals without being constrained by conventional scruples. When Borgia needed to establish order in the Romagna, he appointed a cruel lieutenant to terrorize the population into submission, then had that lieutenant publicly executed when order was established, thus satisfying the people while also demonstrating his own power. This was virtue, understanding what the situation required and having the capability and will to execute it. But virtue is not mere ruthlessness or amorality. It includes intelligence, foresight, adaptability, courage, and the capacity to inspire others. A prince with virtue must be able to read situations accurately, anticipating how others will respond to his actions. He must understand human nature deeply enough to predict behavior and manipulate motivations. He must possess the self-discipline to control his own passions while understanding how to exploit the passions of others. He must be able to project different images, merciful or cruel, trustworthy or dangerous, conventional or extraordinary, as circumstances require. Above all, he must have the decisiveness and courage to act when action is necessary, without being paralyzed by moral scruples or philosophical doubts. The relationship between virtue and fortuna is dynamic and dialectical. Fortune creates the circumstances and opportunities within which political actors must operate. She can destroy even the most capable prince through events beyond his control, foreign invasion, natural disaster, or sudden illness. But virtue can minimize fortune's role by preparing for contingencies, building strong institutions, maintaining military strength, and acting boldly when opportunities arise. A prince with virtue recognizes that he cannot control everything, but he maximizes what he can control while positioning himself to benefit when fortune shifts favorably. Machiavelli illustrates this dynamic through historical examples. Moses had both virtue and favorable fortune. His capabilities were extraordinary, but he also encountered circumstances, the Israelites' bondage in Egypt, that made his people receptive to his leadership. Romulus had similar advantages, but others demonstrated virtue even in unfavorable circumstances. Francesco Sforza rose from being a mercenary captain to become Duke of Milan through pure capability. Agathocles of Syracuse seized power through a brutal massacre of the city's senators, then used his virtue to defend Sicily against Carthaginian invasion. These examples show that while fortune helps, virtue can achieve success even when circumstances are hostile. This framework has revolutionary implications for political ethics. If political success depends on virtue rather than conventional virtue, and if virtue sometimes requires actions that conventional morality condemns, then political leaders must be willing to do evil when circumstances require it. They must learn how not to be good. They must develop what Machiavelli calls criminal virtue, the capacity to act ruthlessly and decisively against moral constraints when political necessity demands. This is not because evil is inherently good, but because political responsibility sometimes requires choosing the lesser evil to avoid greater catastrophe. Consider Machiavelli's analysis of cruelty. He distinguishes between cruelty, well used, and cruelty badly used. Cruelty is well used when it is employed once, comprehensively, and for clear political purposes, establishing order, eliminating threats, deterring future challenges. Cruelty is badly used when it is arbitrary, ongoing, and fails to achieve any clear purpose beyond satisfying the ruler's sadistic impulses. A prince with virtue might employ well-used cruelty if necessary for state security. But he would avoid badly used cruelty both because it is morally gratuitous and because it is politically counterproductive. Notice that Machiavelli's evaluation here is consequentialist rather than deontological. Cruelty is judged by its effects and purposes, not by its intrinsic moral status. This raises the question of whether virtue can be taught or whether it is an innate quality that some possess and others lack. Machiavelli suggests that while natural talent matters, virtue can be developed through study, experience, and self-discipline. This is why he wrote The Prince, quote, to teach aspiring rulers how to develop the qualities necessary for political success. By studying history, learning from the examples of successful princes, understanding human nature, and thinking clearly about political dynamics, a leader can cultivate a virtue, even if he does not possess it naturally. The key is intellectual clarity about what politics actually requires, combined with the psychological capability to act on that understanding without being paralyzed by conventional moral scruples. But Machiavelli also recognizes limits to virtue's power over fortune. Sometimes fortune overwhelms even the most capable prince. Italy's weakness in Machiavelli's time resulted partly from fortune. The coincidental timing of foreign invasions, the accidents of royal marriages that gave France and Spain claims to Italian territories, the military and technological superiority that larger states enjoyed. No amount of virtues possessed by individual Italian princes could completely overcome these structural disadvantages. This recognition prevents Machiavelli's philosophy from degenerating into simple heroic individualism. Political success requires both individual capability and favorable circumstances, and even the greatest virtue cannot guarantee success in the face of overwhelming adversity. Yet Machiavelli insists that despair is never appropriate. Even when fortune seems dominant, virtue can create opportunities and prepare for better times. A prince might lose his state through bad luck, but if he has built strong foundations, good laws, loyal soldiers, popular support, he can recover when circumstances improve. The key is never to surrender to fortune, never to accept defeat as inevitable, always to seek ways to impose human will on circumstances. This attitude of defiant action against whatever fortune brings defines the Machiavellian political actor. This brings us to one of the most persistent criticisms of Machiavelli's framework. Does it not reduce politics to pure power struggle, eliminating any space for genuine moral principle or human decency? If Well is simply the capability to achieve success by whatever means necessary, does this not license any atrocity? If fortune is merely an adversary to be conquered, rather than an expression of divine will or natural justice, does this not drain political life of any transcendent meaning? These concerns are serious, but Machiavelli has responses to them. First, he would argue that his framework does not eliminate moral principles, but relocates them. The highest political morality is serving the security and welfare of the political community. Actions that serve this purpose have moral justification, even when they violate conventional moral rules. Second, he would insist that his analysis is descriptive before it is prescriptive. He is describing how politics actually works, not how we might wish it to work. Ignoring these realities in the name of moral purity does not make them go away. It simply ensures that morally scrupulous actors will be destroyed by less scrupulous rivals. Third, he would point out that his framework still distinguishes between legitimate and illegitimate uses of power. Cruelty well used for state security is different from cruelty badly used for personal satisfaction. Deception employed strategically to protect the community is different from lying for private advantage. The tension between virtue and fortuna creates the dramatic structure of political life in Machiavelli's vision. Politics is not a peaceful garden where virtue naturally flourishes, nor is it a realm of pure chaos where nothing can be controlled. It is a battlefield where human capability struggles against overwhelming circumstances, where intelligence and courage can sometimes impose order on disorder, where decisive action can sometimes triumph over seemingly inevitable fate. This vision is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic, acknowledging both human power and human limits, both what can be mastered and what must be endured. The Prince, Machiavelli's most famous and infamous work, focuses on a specific political problem. How can a new prince, someone who has recently acquired power through conquest, inheritance, or fortune, establish and maintain control over his state? This might seem like a narrow technical question, relevant only to Renaissance Italy, but Machiavelli uses it to explore fundamental issues about political power, legitimacy, and stability that remain relevant in any political context. The New Prince serves as an analytical device for examining political power in its rawest form, stripped of the legitimacy that tradition and habit provide to established rulers. The distinction between new and hereditary princes is crucial to Machiavelli's analysis. A hereditary prince enjoys enormous advantages. His subjects are accustomed to his family's rule. Existing institutions and power structures already support his authority. He can govern conventionally, without extraordinary measures, because tradition legitimizes his position. As long as he does not commit extraordinary errors, inertia and habit will maintain him in power. But a new prince has none of these advantages. He must create legitimacy rather than inherit it. He must build supporting institutions rather than inherit them. He must overcome his subjects' attachment to previous rulers and their suspicion of his authority. He operates in a far more precarious situation that requires far greater virtue. Machiavelli identifies different types of new princes based on how they acquired power. Some rise through fortune in the arms of others, like those who purchase their states or receive them through another's favor. Others rise through their own virtue and arms, conquering territory through their own capability and forces. Others seize power through crime, entering their states as private citizens and becoming princes through treachery and violence. Each path to power creates different challenges and requires different strategies for maintaining authority. Those who rise through fortune face particular dangers. Their ascent is rapid and easy, but their position is correspondingly fragile. Having acquired power through another's favor rather than their own capability, they lack the surge necessary to maintain it when circumstances change. Like plants whose roots have not grown deep, they are easily uprooted by the first storm. Machiavelli illustrates this through the example of Cesare Borgia, who acquired his state through his father's position as Pope Alexander VI. Borgia recognized his precarious position and worked energetically to build an independent power base through military strength, political alliances, and brutal elimination of threats. He possessed extraordinary virtue, but when fortune turned against him, his father died suddenly, and Borgia himself fell ill at the crucial moment. Even his capability proved insufficient. This demonstrates that virtues alone cannot always overcome extremely adverse fortune, but it also shows that those who rise through fortune must work immediately to build foundations based on their own capability. Those who rise through their own virtues and arms face opposite advantages and challenges. Their ascent is difficult and dangerous, requiring sustained effort and extraordinary capability. But once they succeed in acquiring power, they find it relatively easy to maintain because they have already demonstrated the qualities necessary for rule. Francesco Sforza exemplifies this path, rising from mercenary captain to Duke of Milan through decades of military and political struggle. Having conquered his state through his own capability, he possessed both the skills and the reputation necessary to maintain it. The foundations built through struggle prove stronger than those acquired through luck. But Machiavelli's most controversial analysis concerns those who rise through crime, seizing power through betrayal, assassination, or massacre. He does not shy away from this category, but examines it with the same clinical detachment he applies to other paths to power. The key question is not whether such actions are morally acceptable, but whether they can succeed politically and, if so, under what conditions. His answer is complex. Criminal paths to power can succeed, but only when crimes are committed decisively, comprehensively, and followed by policies that benefit the population. Crime alone does not create stable rule, but crime combined with subsequent good government can. His example is Agathocles of Syracuse, who rose from humble origins to become king by assembling the senators and richest citizens, then having his soldiers massacre them in a single day. This opened the path to his seizure of power. But Agathocles did not rest on this crime. He used his newly acquired authority to defend Syracuse against Carthaginian invasion and to establish reasonably just internal government. Machiavelli concludes that Agathocles possessed virtues that enabled him to rise to power and maintain it, even though he lacked glory because his methods were too criminal. Notice the distinction here. Agathocles succeeded politically but failed morally. He achieved stable power but not legitimate honor. This suggests that Machiavelli recognizes moral categories even while analyzing political success. This analysis of criminal paths to power reveals Machiavelli's fundamental methodology. He does not begin by asking what is morally permissible, but by asking what is politically effective. He then distinguishes between crimes well used and crimes badly used, judging them by their consequences rather than their intrinsic moral status. Crimes are well used when they are committed all at once, out of necessity for securing power, and then not repeated. The perpetrator instead converts to policies beneficial to his subjects. Crimes are badly used when they are few at first, but grow rather than diminish over time. A prince who uses crimes well can maintain his position and even gain his subjects' support. A prince who uses them badly will be destroyed by the accumulating resentment his ongoing cruelty creates. This consequentialist analysis of political action reaches its fullest expression in Machiavelli's discussions of how a new prince should consolidate power. He must eliminate threats from the families of previous rulers. He must either destroy conquered cities that previously lived freely or reside there personally. He must avoid being hated by the common people while neutralizing the ambitions of nobles. He must maintain military strength under his direct control rather than relying on mercenaries or auxiliaries. He must cultivate a reputation for decisiveness and strength while appearing conventionally virtuous when circumstances permit. Each of these prescriptions violates conventional moral principles to some degree, but each serves the fundamental political requirement, establishing secure authority. The problem of maintaining newly acquired states becomes particularly acute when dealing with conquered territories. If the conquered people share language and customs with the conqueror, assimilation is relatively easy. But when they differ, the challenges multiply. Machiavelli's advice here is brutally practical. The conqueror should either destroy the conquered city, reside there personally, or establish colonies. Destruction eliminates the problem by eliminating the people who might rebel. Personal residence demonstrates commitment and allows the prince to detect and suppress conspiracies early. Colonies are less expensive than garrisons and harm only those whose lands are taken, who are too few and scattered to resist, while the rest of the population benefits from the order the prince provides. These prescriptions shocked Machiavelli's readers and continue to shock today. They seem to advocate what we would now call ethnic cleansing or colonialism, but we must understand them in context. Machiavelli was not advocating random violence or gratuitous cruelty. He was analyzing what made some conquests stable and others unstable, what enabled some rulers to maintain control and others to face perpetual rebellion. His clinical analysis treated human populations as political problems to be solved rather than as bearers of rights to be respected. This dehumanizing perspective is morally troubling, but it accurately describes how political power often operates, a fact that does not cease to be true merely because we find it uncomfortable. The new prince's greatest challenge is winning acceptance from his subjects. Traditional authority enjoys legitimacy through custom and habit. Subjects obey because their ancestors obeyed, because the social order seems natural and inevitable. But the new prince lacks this legitimizing tradition. He must create acceptance through other means, demonstrating strength, providing security, dispensing benefits, eliminating rivals, and managing his reputation. This requires both vertive, the capability to take effective action, and fortune, favorable circumstances that allow adversity to manifest itself successfully. Machiavelli's analysis of new princes reveals his deeper understanding of political power. Power does not rest primarily on force, though force is necessary. It rests on a complex combination of capability, reputation, institutions, and circumstances that create stable authority. A new prince must build this combination from scratch, which is why his situation demands such extraordinary virtue, and why Machiavelli finds new princes more analytically interesting than hereditary ones. The new prince's challenge, establishing authority where none existed before, illuminates the fundamental requirements of all political power. This focus on new princes also reveals Machiavelli's deeper political concerns. He was writing during a period when Italy faced existential threats from foreign powers. Traditional institutions and hereditary rulers had proven inadequate to defend Italian independence. What Italy needed, Machiavelli believed, was a new prince with extraordinary virtue, someone who could unify the peninsula, build military strength, and expel foreign invaders. The prince was not merely an academic analysis, but a handbook for this hoped-for redeemer. The work's final chapter makes this explicit, calling for a new prince to liberate Italy from the barbarians, and comparing him to Moses, Cyrus, and Theseus, founders of nations, rather than merely successful rulers. This transforms our understanding of the prince's purpose. It was not written as a general theory of tyranny, but as a specific response to a historical crisis. Machiavelli was willing to counsel methods he might have found morally troubling in other contexts, because he believed Italy's survival required a leader willing to act decisively and ruthlessly. The work's shocking prescriptions emerge not from indifference to morality, but from desperate concern for Italy's political survival. When a political community faces existential threats, normal moral constraints may need to give way to emergency measures. This is the ultimate justification for the new prince's extraordinary actions. Yet this contextualization does not fully resolve the moral problems Machiavelli's analysis creates. Even if we grant that existential threats justify extraordinary measures, who determines what counts as an existential threat? How do we prevent rulers from exaggerating dangers to justify abuses of power? What prevents the temporary expedients recommended for new princes from becoming permanent features of governance? These questions haunt Machiavelli's work and continue to haunt political philosophy. The problem of the new prince, how to establish legitimate authority where none exists, remains relevant whenever political communities face founding moments or existential crises. While The Prince remains Machiavelli's most famous work, his Discourses on Livy presents a very different and in some ways contrary vision of politics, where the prince analyzes princely rule and counsels methods appropriate for monarchical government. The Discourses celebrates republican government and explores the conditions under which political freedom can be established and maintained. This has led some readers to see fundamental contradictions in Machiavelli's thought. How can the same person advocate both princely absolutism and republican liberty? But understanding Machiavelli's republicanism reveals not contradiction, but complementarity. Different political situations require different governmental forms, and the wise political analyst must understand both. Discourses takes the form of extended commentary on Livy's history of Rome, using Roman examples to explore political principles. Machiavelli's Rome is not the idealized republic of classical tradition, but a rough, violent, and contentious city whose greatness emerged from, rather than despite, its internal conflicts. This revisionist reading of Roman history supports Machiavelli's broader argument about republican government. Properly channeled conflict between social classes strengthens rather than weakens republics. This directly contradicted the conventional wisdom of his time, which held that political stability required harmony and the suppression of factional strife. Machiavelli begins this Discourses by analyzing different types of government. He adopts and modifies the classical typology: principality, rule by one; aristocracy, rule by the few; and democracy, rule by the many. Each type has a corresponding corrupt form. Principality degenerates into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, democracy into license. But rather than seeking the single best form of government, Machiavelli argues that the best constitution combines elements of all three, with each checking the other's tendencies toward corruption. This mixed constitution characterized republican Rome and explained its superiority to purely aristocratic Sparta or purely democratic Athens. But Machiavelli's republicanism involves far more than constitutional mechanics. It rests on a particular conception of political freedom and civic virtue that distinguishes it from both classical republicanism and modern liberalism. For Machiavelli, political freedom does not primarily mean individual liberty to pursue private interests without state interference, the modern liberal conception. Nor does it mean philosophical contemplation and withdrawal from political life, the classical philosophical ideal. Political freedom means active participation in self-government, collective autonomy from domination by external powers or internal tyrants, and the opportunity to pursue glory through service to one's political community. This conception of freedom has several crucial implications. First, it makes freedom a collective rather than purely individual good. A person living under foreign domination or domestic tyranny lacks freedom, even if he enjoys considerable personal liberty in his private life. Conversely, a citizen of a free republic possesses freedom even if republican laws constrain his behavior, because those laws express collective self-determination rather than alien imposition. Freedom is about who rules rather than how much they rule, self-rule rather than limited rule. Second, this conception makes freedom inseparable from virtue, not conventional moral virtue, but civic virtue, the disposition to put the common good ahead of private interest when the two conflict. A republic cannot survive if its citizens are wholly devoted to private concerns, indifferent to public affairs, or willing to sacrifice civic freedom for personal security. Republican freedom requires citizens who will fight for their city, participate in its governance, expose corruption, and resist tyranny even at personal cost. This makes citizenship demanding rather than comfortable, active rather than passive. Third, this conception recognizes that freedom is fragile and always threatened. It must be defended militarily against foreign conquest and politically against domestic tyranny. It requires constant vigilance because corruption, the decay of civic virtue, constantly threatens to undermine republican institutions. A free republic is an achievement that must be continually renewed rather than a stable condition that can be taken for granted once established. Machiavelli's analysis of how republics maintain freedom focuses heavily on Rome's institutional arrangements and political practices. The key to Roman success, he argues, lay in the conflict between plebeians and patricians, the common people and the aristocracy. Where conventional wisdom saw this conflict as a weakness that threatened Roman stability, Machiavelli saw it as a strength that guaranteed Roman freedom. The plebeians' determination to resist patrician domination led to the creation of the tribunes, officials who could veto patrician legislation and protect plebeian interests. This institutionalized conflict prevented either class from dominating the other and forced both to consider the common good. This revisionist reading of Roman history supports a broader point about political health. Republics should not suppress factional conflict, but channel it through appropriate institutions. The appearance of harmony often masks the domination of one group over others. Apparent stability purchased at the cost of freedom. Better to have open conflict that forces each faction to compromise and consider others' interests than false harmony that allows one faction to tyrannize. This is one of Machiavelli's most original and important political insights. Properly structured conflict can be politically creative rather than destructive. But Machiavelli's republicanism is neither democratic nor egalitarian in the modern sense. He does not believe all citizens are equally capable of political judgment or equally entitled to political power. He recognizes distinctions between nobles and common people, between the capable few and the mediocre many. What he insists upon is that both groups must have voice and power in a healthy republic. The nobles bring ambition, capability, and leadership. The common people bring numerical strength and a desire to avoid oppression. Each checks the other's dangerous tendencies: noble ambition to dominate, popular tendency toward license and disorder. This leads to Machiavelli's analysis of the different goals of nobles and commoners. The nobles desire to dominate. The people desire not to be dominated. These are not symmetrical desires. The people's desire for non-domination is more compatible with republican freedom than the nobles' desire for domination. This is why Machiavelli, while recognizing the nobles' political capabilities, ultimately sides with the people as the guardians of liberty. A republic should be ordered to serve popular rather than noble interests, not because the people are morally superior, but because their political goals better align with the common good. Yet Machiavelli also recognizes dangers in popular government. The people can be manipulated by demagogues. They make poor judgments about particular policies. They tend toward conservative caution rather than bold action. They can be swayed by immediate passions rather than long-term interests. A healthy republic must therefore combine popular power with institutional safeguards against popular error. The people should choose leaders, but not micromanage policy. They should have veto power over legislation, but not necessarily the power to initiate it. They should judge leaders' results, but not their methods. This brings us to one of the most interesting tensions in Machiavelli's thought: the relationship between popular government and political effectiveness. Republics face the same threats that principalities face: foreign invasion, internal conspiracy, natural disaster. They must respond with the same decisiveness and sometimes the same ruthlessness. But republican institutions, with their dispersed power and deliberative procedures, often inhibit quick, decisive action. This creates a dilemma. How can republics maintain the internal freedom that defines them, while also developing the external power necessary to defend that freedom? Machiavelli's answer involves several institutional mechanisms. First, republics should invest dictatorial power in a single individual during emergencies, as Rome created the office of dictator with 6-month terms. This allows for decisive action when necessary while preventing permanent tyranny. Second, republics should encourage military virtue among citizens rather than relying on professional armies. Citizen soldiers fight for their own freedom rather than for pay, making them more reliable defenders. Third, republics should cultivate leaders who possess both political ambition and devotion to the republic, using the former to serve the latter. But the deeper answer involves recognizing that different governmental forms suit different circumstances. In times of founding or existential crisis, princely government may be necessary. A new prince can act decisively, ignore factional interests, and establish the basic security that makes republican government possible. But once established, republican government proves superior for maintaining long-term political health and achieving greatness. Machiavelli illustrates this through Roman history. Rome needed kings for its founding, but achieved greatness only after expelling them and establishing republican institutions. This explains the apparent contradiction between the prince and the discourses. Machiavelli is not contradicting himself, but analyzing different political situations. Italy in his time faced a founding crisis requiring extraordinary leadership, hence the Prince's Council for New Princes. But Machiavelli's ultimate ideal was republican government, hence the discourses, detailed analysis of republican institutions. The new prince was a necessary expedient for creating conditions under which republican government might eventually flourish. Machiavelli's republicanism also involves a distinctive understanding of historical change and political decay. Republics, like all human institutions, tend toward corruption over time. The civic virtue that makes republican freedom possible, gradually erodes as citizens become comfortable, selfish, and unwilling to sacrifice for the common good. Wealth accumulates and inequality grows, creating factions more interested in their own advancement than the republic's welfare. Leaders emerge who use popular support to establish personal power. Foreign threats diminish and military virtue decays. Eventually, the republic collapses into tyranny or foreign conquest. This cyclical view of political history was common in classical thought, but Machiavelli transformed it by arguing that corruption could be resisted through proper institutions and periodic renewal. Rome maintained its freedom for centuries by returning periodically to its founding principles, by maintaining institutions that checked corruption, and by expanding rather than remaining static. Expansion forced Romans to maintain military virtue and gave ambitious citizens opportunities to serve the republic rather than subvert it. This suggests that political decay is not inevitable, but can be resisted through institutional design and civic commitment. Yet, Machiavelli also recognizes limits to republican expansion and longevity. Eventually, all republics fall, either to foreign conquest or internal corruption. There is no permanent solution to political problems, no perfect constitution that will last forever. Human affairs are fundamentally unstable, and political wisdom consists in managing rather than eliminating that instability. This tragic dimension of Machiavelli's republicanism distinguishes it from more optimistic political theories that promise permanent peace or perpetual progress. The relationship between the prince and the discourses reveals the full complexity of Machiavelli's political vision. He is neither simply an advocate for tyranny, nor simply a republican idealist. He is a realist who understands that different circumstances require different governmental forms, that political communities face genuine dilemmas with no perfect solutions, and that political analysis must remain flexible rather than dogmatic. His republicanism is tempered by recognition of popular limitations and the occasional necessity for princely power. His counsel to princes is tempered by preference for republican freedom when circumstances permit. This flexibility, rooted in realistic assessment rather than ideological commitment, characterizes Machiavelli's entire approach to politics. Perhaps no aspect of Machiavelli's thought was more central to his entire political philosophy than his understanding of military power. For Machiavelli, politics and war were inseparable. A political community that could not defend itself militarily would inevitably lose its independence and freedom. A leader who lacked military capability would eventually lose power regardless of his other virtues. Military strength was not one political consideration among many, but the foundation upon which all other political goods rested. This conviction emerged from Machiavelli's first-hand observation of Italy's catastrophic military weakness during the French and Spanish invasions, and it shaped his analysis of everything from constitutional design to individual leadership. Machiavelli's most fundamental military insight was that only citizen armies could be truly reliable. Professional mercenaries, who fought for pay rather than for their own communities, lacked the motivation to fight effectively. They would avoid genuine combat when possible, flee when battles turned against them, and sometimes betray their employers for better offers. Auxiliary troops borrowed from allied states were equally dangerous because they remained loyal to their own princes rather than to those they ostensibly served. The only soldiers who could be trusted to fight effectively were those defending their own land, families, and freedom. This meant that military effectiveness required broad citizen participation in military affairs, which in turn required republican political structures that gave citizens a stake in their community's survival. This argument directly challenged the military practices dominant in Renaissance Italy. Italian states typically relied on condottieri, mercenary captains who contracted to provide military forces, This system had several apparent advantages. It allowed states to avoid the disruption and expense of maintaining standing armies. It employed professional soldiers rather than amateur citizens, and it limited the destructiveness of warfare by making battles into relatively bloodless maneuvers between professionals who preferred negotiation to combat. But Machiavelli saw these apparent advantages as fatal weaknesses. Mercenaries had no reason to fight to the death, so battles remained indecisive. They had every incentive to prolong wars to maximize their employment. Sometimes they betrayed their employers or extorted additional payment under threat of abandonment. Most importantly, mercenary armies could not defeat the national armies of France and Spain, whose soldiers fought for their kings and nations rather than merely for pay. Machiavelli illustrated this critique through countless examples from both ancient and modern history. Ancient Rome conquered the world with citizen legions. Carthage's reliance on mercenaries led to repeated disasters and eventual destruction. Venice's mercenary forces proved ineffective against genuine military threats. Florence's hired armies failed repeatedly against its enemies. Meanwhile, the Swiss, who relied on citizen militias, achieved military success disproportionate to their small population. The French monarchy's national army overran Italy with ease. The lesson was clear. Military effectiveness required that soldiers have personal stakes in victory, which meant citizen soldiers rather than hired professionals. But Machiavelli's argument went deeper than mere military effectiveness. He argued that citizen armies were essential for maintaining political freedom. A prince or republic that relied on others for military protection became dependent on those others and therefore vulnerable to their domination. A state that could not defend itself would eventually become a satellite of more powerful neighbors. More insidiously, reliance on professional armies created internal political dangers. Mercenary captains sometimes used their military power to seize political control, as Caesar had done in Rome and as Sforza had done in Milan. Even when mercenaries did not overtly seize power, their presence shifted political authority away from citizens and toward military professionals. This connection between military organization and political structure was central to Machiavelli's entire political philosophy. Republican government required citizen soldiers, and citizen soldiers in turn supported republican institutions. A state of armed citizens was difficult to tyrannize because citizens possessed the means to resist oppression. A republic whose defense depended on citizen virtue had to maintain the civic engagement and public spirit that republican freedom required. Conversely, a state that disarmed its citizens or relied on professional armies was already on the path toward tyranny, because it had separated political power from military capability and made citizens dependent on others for protection. Machiavelli put these theories into practice during his service to Florence. He successfully advocated for the creation of a citizen militia, recruited primarily from the rural territories under Florentine control. He personally supervised the militia's organization, training, and deployment. The militia achieved some initial successes, particularly in the reconquest of Pisa. But when Spanish professional soldiers attacked Florence in 1512, the militia proved inadequate to the challenge. Florence fell, the Republic collapsed, and Machiavelli lost his position. This failure might seem to discredit his military theories, but Machiavelli attributed it to inadequate time and resources rather than to fundamental flaws in the concept. A citizen militia required years to develop proper training, discipline, and combat experience. Florence's militia had been rushed into existence and deployed against professional soldiers before it was ready. The question of military organization also raised profound questions about political economy and social structure. Maintaining effective citizen armies required certain social conditions. Citizens needed to possess sufficient property and independence to give them a stake in the community's welfare. They needed to be organized through institutions, such as guilds or neighborhood associations, that could serve as the basis for military units. They needed to develop martial virtues, courage, discipline, loyalty, through their regular social life rather than merely through military training. And the state needed to be organized to mobilize these citizen soldiers when necessary, without disrupting the economy so severely that military success led to economic collapse. These requirements created tensions with other political and economic goals. Training citizens for military service required time and resources that might otherwise go to productive economic activity. Maintaining the civic virtue necessary for effective citizen armies might conflict with the commercial development that created wealth. Preserving the rough equality necessary for Republican civic life might inhibit the economic dynamism that came from allowing wealth accumulation and social mobility. Machiavelli was aware of these tensions, but believed that military security had to take priority over economic prosperity. A wealthy state that could not defend itself would eventually lose both its wealth and its freedom to foreign conquest. Machiavelli also analyzed the relationship between military effectiveness and political leadership. A prince or republican magistrate needed personal military knowledge and experience to command effectively and to maintain the respect of soldiers. Leaders who lacked military capability were vulnerable to being dominated by their generals or captains. They could not evaluate military advice critically, and therefore risked being manipulated by military professionals who might pursue their own interests rather than the state's. Moreover, military command provided opportunities for glory and popular acclaim that enhanced political authority. Roman consuls achieved their reputations through military victories, which then gave them political influence. A leader who demonstrated military virtue could use that reputation to accomplish political goals that would otherwise be impossible. This created a dilemma, particularly for republics. Military command concentrated power in individuals, but concentration of power threatened republican freedom. Rome solved this through term limits, collective leadership, and institutional checks on commanders' authority. But these solutions were always imperfect and sometimes broke down, as with Caesar's use of his military reputation to overthrow the Republic. Yet the alternative, keeping military command dispersed and weak, left republics vulnerable to foreign threats. This was another example of the fundamental tensions in republican government that Machiavelli analyzed without being able to fully resolve. The technological dimension of military power also interested Machiavelli. He lived during the period when gunpowder weapons were transforming warfare. Traditional fortifications became vulnerable to artillery bombardment. Heavy cavalry, long dominant on European battlefields, lost effectiveness against infantry armed with pikes and firearms. Naval warfare was revolutionized by ships mounting cannons. These technological changes had profound political implications. They increased the cost of effective military forces, giving advantages to larger states that could afford artillery trains and fortification improvements. They increased the importance of infantry, which potentially strengthened republics relative to aristocratic cavalry-based armies. They made surprise attacks more difficult because artillery required extensive logistical preparation. But Machiavelli did not believe that technology determined military outcomes. Superior tactics, leadership, and especially soldier motivation could overcome technological disadvantages. The Swiss had defeated armored knights despite lacking heavy cavalry themselves. Properly led infantry could resist cavalry charges that previous generations considered irresistible. Superior generalship could compensate for inferior numbers or equipment. This meant that military virtue, both in soldiers and in commanders, remained more important than technological sophistication. Small states could still defend themselves against larger neighbors if they maintained citizen armies with proper training and motivation. Machiavelli's military thought also included sophisticated analysis of strategy and tactics. He studied ancient military writers, particularly Vegetius and Livy, and drew lessons from their descriptions of Roman practice. He emphasized the importance of discipline, training, and unit cohesion. He analyzed how terrain could be used to offset numerical disadvantages. He discussed the relative merits of different weapons and unit types. He explored the psychological dimensions of combat, how maintaining soldier morale and breaking enemy morale often determined outcomes more than casualties inflicted. This tactical and strategic analysis was not merely technical, but connected to his broader political philosophy. Military effectiveness required combining individual virtue with institutional organization, subordinating private interests to collective goals, and developing practices through experience rather than theoretical speculation. The relationship between military power and political legitimacy was another crucial dimension of Machiavelli's analysis. Political authority ultimately rested on force, the capacity to compel obedience through violence or its threat. Laws, customs, and institutions were effective only when backed by military power capable of enforcing them. A state that could not defend its laws with force would see those laws ignored or overthrown. This did not mean that force alone was sufficient for legitimate authority. Purely coercive rule generated constant resistance and was ultimately unstable, but it did mean that force was necessary even if not sufficient. Good laws and good arms reinforced each other, but arms came first because arms made laws possible. This brings us to one of Machiavelli's most famous aphorisms: a prince should have no other object or thought, nor acquire skill in anything except war, its organization, and its discipline. This was not merely advice about how princes should spend their time. It was a claim about the fundamental basis of political power. Military capability was not one political tool among many, but the foundation on which all other political achievements rested. A leader who neglected military affairs would lose his state regardless of his other virtues. A state that neglected military preparedness would lose its independence regardless of its cultural achievements or economic prosperity. Yet Machiavelli also recognized that military power had to be subordinated to political purposes rather than becoming an end in itself. Rome had been great not merely because of its military strength, but because that strength served republican political structures and enabled expansion that spread Roman civilization. Military virtue needed to be directed by political wisdom, or it would degenerate into mere violence without constructive purpose. The relationship between military power and political order was dialectical, each required and shaped the other. Machiavelli's treatment of religion represents one of the most controversial aspects of his thought, and one of the clearest breaks with the political philosophy that preceded him. Where medieval and Renaissance political thought generally assumed that religion provided the moral and metaphysical foundation for political authority, Machiavelli treated religion instrumentally, as a tool for political control, whose value lay in its political effects rather than its metaphysical truth. This approach shocked religious readers, and continues to disturb those who believe that political philosophy should respect religion's transcendent claims. But Machiavelli's analysis of religion's political functions remains one of his most penetrating insights into how political communities maintain cohesion and motivate citizens. Machiavelli's fundamental observation was that successful political communities require shared beliefs that motivate citizens to sacrifice private interests for collective goals. Purely rational calculation will not produce the civic virtue necessary for political health. Citizens need to believe that their community has transcendent significance, that its laws and customs reflect some higher order, and that violation of civic obligations brings not merely legal penalties, but metaphysical consequences. Religion provides these beliefs by grounding political authority in divine will, civic duties in religious obligations, and political community in cosmic order. Religion transforms political requirements into sacred duties, making compliance a matter of spiritual salvation rather than merely prudent calculation. This understanding led Machiavelli to analyze different religions based on their political effects rather than their theological truth. He famously contrasted Roman religion with Christianity, arguing that Roman religion had strengthened the state while Christianity had weakened it. Roman religions celebrated martial virtues, encouraged civic engagement, and sacralized political authority. Roman gods demanded military victory and civic devotion. Roman religious practices reinforced social hierarchies and political institutions. Augury and divination provided religious legitimacy for political decisions. Roman religious festivals created occasions for demonstrating civic unity and military prowess. All of this made Roman religion an instrument for state power. Christianity, by contrast, valorized humility, patience, and otherworldliness. It taught that the highest virtues were poverty, chastity, and obedience rather than wealth, fertility, and command. It encouraged contemplation rather than action, submission rather than ambition, forgiveness rather than revenge. It directed human attention toward heaven rather than earthly glory. Most damaging from a political perspective, it created a separate sphere of religious authority, the church, that competed with secular political authority and sometimes superseded it. Christianity's political effects were to weaken states rather than strengthen them, to undermine civic virtue rather than reinforce it, and to create divided loyalties that made effective governance more difficult. This critique was extraordinarily dangerous in Machiavelli's time. The Church was the most powerful institution in Italy, and questioning Christianity's political benefits invited accusations of heresy. But Machiavelli was not primarily attacking Christianity as such. He was analyzing how religious beliefs affect political behavior, and arguing that political leaders must understand these effects. His critique targeted not Christian theology but Christian practice as it had developed through the medieval and Renaissance periods. If Christianity made states weak, this was not because of anything in Christian revelation, but because Christians had misinterpreted or misapplied their own teachings. Indeed, Machiavelli sometimes suggested that Christianity could be politically useful if properly interpreted. A religion teaching submission and forgiveness could make subjects easier to govern. Christian concepts of sin and salvation could be used to encourage civic obedience. The Church's organizational structure and ritual practices could be adapted to serve state purposes. The key was for political leaders to shape religious interpretation and practice to serve political, rather than ecclesiastical interests. Religion needed to be subordinated to the state, rather than competing with it. This instrumental view of religion raised profound questions about religious truth and political morality. If religion's value lies in its political effects rather than its metaphysical accuracy, does this imply that religious claims need not be true to be valuable? If political leaders should manipulate religious belief to serve state purposes, does this make religion a form of noble lie, useful deception that serves the common good even while being false? If rulers should appear religious while privately skeptical, does this undermine the very religious conviction that makes religion politically effective? Machiavelli never fully addressed these questions, perhaps because doing so would have made his work too dangerous to publish, or perhaps because he considered them irrelevant to political analysis. His concern was with how religion functions politically, not with whether religious claims are true. This methodological approach, separating functional analysis from truth claims, became characteristic of modern social science, but it created enduring problems for understanding the relationship between religious commitment and political order. The question of religious sincerity was particularly vexing. Machiavelli argued that leaders should appear religious, even if privately skeptical, because religious observance gained popular support and legitimized political authority. But if leaders were merely performing religion without genuine belief, would not their hypocrisy eventually become apparent and undermine the very religious conviction they sought to exploit? How could leaders manipulate religion effectively while remaining privately cynical about religious truth? Would not successful manipulation require at least some degree of genuine belief? Roman history provided Machiavelli with examples of sophisticated religious instrumentalization. Roman senators apparently did not believe literally in the gods whose worship they maintained. Yet they carefully preserved religious rituals and institutions because these served political purposes. They used religious authority to legitimize political decisions. They manipulated augury to provide divine sanction for policies. They prosecuted religious innovations that threatened political stability. This combination of private skepticism and public orthodoxy seemed to work for Rome, at least until Christianity undermined traditional religious practices. But Machiavelli also recognized dangers in excessive or misguided religious enthusiasm. When religion became too powerful relative to political authority, it could paralyze effective governance by imposing constraints the political necessity required violating. When religious leaders pursued their own interests rather than those of the state, they could undermine political unity and weaken collective defense. When religious commitments created loyalties that transcended political boundaries, they could make citizens unreliable servants of their own states. Religious crusades, religious civil wars, and conflicts between religious and secular authority all demonstrated how religion could be politically destructive rather than constructive. The relationship between Christianity and political power in Machiavelli's time exemplified these dangers. The papacy was simultaneously a spiritual institution claiming universal authority and a temporal Italian state, pursuing its own political interests. These dual roles created constant conflict between papal religious claims and papal political practice. Popes used spiritual weapons, excommunication, interdict, crusade, to advance political goals. They used political power to enforce religious conformity. They allied with foreign powers against Italian states when doing so served papal interests. This combination of religious authority and political ambition made the papacy one of the chief obstacles to Italian political unity and military effectiveness. Machiavelli's solution was clear. Religious authority needed to be subordinated to political authority. The state should control religious institutions, determine religious practice, and use religion as an instrument for achieving political goals. This was essentially an argument for what would later be called Caesaropapism, the subordination of church to state, the use of religious authority to serve political purposes, and the rejection of any religious claims that transcended or limited political sovereignty. This position directly challenged medieval and Catholic political theology, which had insisted on the independence and in some respects superiority of spiritual authority. The practical implications of this view were radical. Political leaders should determine which religious doctrines were taught and which suppressed, based on their political utility rather than their theological truth. Religious institutions should be reformed or suppressed when they conflicted with state interests. Religious enthusiasm should be encouraged when it serves state purposes, such as motivating soldiers or encouraging civic sacrifice, but dampened when it threatened political stability. Foreign religious authorities should be excluded from domestic affairs. Religious minorities should be tolerated or suppressed based on political calculation rather than principle. These prescriptions anticipated much of what would happen during the Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation, when secular rulers increasingly asserted control over religious institutions within their territories. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, that rulers determine their territory's official religion, represented the triumph of Machiavellian religious instrumentalism over medieval religious universalism. The subordination of churches to secular states, the use of religious orthodoxy as a criterion for political loyalty, and the enforcement of religious conformity as a tool of political control, all reflected Machiavellian principles, even when enacted by leaders who would have denounced Machiavelli's explicit teachings. Yet Machiavelli also recognized limits to religious instrumentalization. Religion could not be completely fabricated or maintained through pure cynicism. Effective religious political utility required that citizens genuinely believe, which meant that religious teachings could not appear obviously false or transparently manipulative. Religious institutions needed sufficient autonomy to maintain credibility even while serving political purposes. Religious leaders needed to believe in their own teachings sufficiently to inspire confidence in others. The noble lie had to be sufficiently ennobled to be believed. This created a dilemma that Machiavelli could analyze but not fully resolve. Political leaders needed to manipulate religion without appearing to manipulate it, to use religious authority while respecting it sufficiently to maintain its effectiveness, and to balance religious claims against political necessities without destroying the religious conviction that made religion politically useful. This required a sophistication that few leaders possessed, and that often broke down in practice, either into crude instrumentalization that destroyed religious credibility or into religious enthusiasm that paralyzed political effectiveness. The relationship between religion and civic virtue was particularly important in Machiavelli's analysis. He argued that Roman religion had inculcated martial virtues and civic devotion by celebrating military glory, encouraging public service, and sanctifying political authority. But Christianity, at least as practiced in Machiavelli's time, seemed to inculcate private virtues incompatible with civic life, humility rather than ambition, withdrawal rather than engagement, forgiveness rather than justice. If political communities needed religion to maintain civic virtue, but Christianity undermined that virtue, what was to be done? Machiavelli's answer seemed to be that Christianity needed to be reinterpreted to emphasize its politically useful aspects while downplaying those that weaken states. Christian teachings about justice, order, and obedience could support political authority. Christian concepts of duty and sacrifice could motivate civic service. Christian institutions and rituals could create social cohesion. The challenge was to emphasize these aspects while marginalizing otherworldliness, excessive mercy, and divided loyalty between church and state. This required either religious reform or cynical manipulation, and probably both. At the foundation of Machiavelli's entire political philosophy lies a particular understanding of human nature, an understanding that is pessimistic without being entirely cynical, realistic without denying human capacity for greatness, and consistent without being deterministic. Machiavelli believed that human beings are fundamentally driven by self-interest, prone to ingratitude and inconstancy, more moved by fear than by love, and predictable in their responses to incentives. These observations about human nature informed all of his political prescriptions, and distinguished his approach from more optimistic political philosophies that assumed human rationality, moral perfectibility, or natural sociability. Machiavelli's pessimism about human nature appears throughout his works, but reaches its starkest expression in The Prince. One can make this generalization about men. They are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit. This is not momentary cynicism, but a consistent theme. Machiavelli believed that most people, most of the time, would prioritize their own interests over collective goods, would break promises when doing so seemed advantageous, would abandon leaders when following them became dangerous, and would generally behave selfishly, unless constrained by fear of punishment or hope of reward. This pessimistic assessment distinguished Machiavelli sharply from classical and Christian political philosophers who would generally assume that human beings possess natural sociability, rational capacity for moral improvement, or divine inspiration toward goodness. Aristotle had argued that man was naturally a political animal who found fulfillment through civic participation. Christian theology taught that humans were created in God's image and capable of salvation through divine grace. Renaissance humanists celebrated human dignity, creativity, and potential for excellence. Against all of these optimistic assessments, Machiavelli insisted on a much darker view. Humans were unreliable, selfish, and dominated by passions rather than reason. Yet, Machiavelli's pessimism was not total. He recognized that humans were capable of extraordinary achievements: military valor, artistic brilliance, political wisdom, self-sacrificing devotion to their communities. Rome's greatness testified to human potential for civic virtue and collective accomplishment. Individual leaders like Moses, Cyrus, and Romulus demonstrated human capacity for founding nations and establishing order from chaos. Even in Machiavelli's own time, some leaders and citizens displayed virtues that transcended narrow self-interest. Machiavelli's view of human nature was therefore complex. Humans were capable of greatness, but usually settled for selfishness. They could rise to heroism under the right circumstances, but normally sought comfort and security. They possessed potential for virtue, but required proper institutions and incentives to realize that potential. This understanding of human nature led directly to Machiavelli's political realism. If humans are fundamentally self-interested and unreliable, political institutions cannot assume virtuous behavior from either leaders or citizens. Instead, institutions must be designed to channel selfish motives toward public goods, to create situations where private interest coincides with collective benefit, and to establish incentives that make cooperation more advantageous than defection. Constitutional structures should assume that officials will abuse power unless constrained, that citizens will shirk duties unless compelled, and that factions will pursue narrow interests unless checked by opposing factions. This approach represented a fundamental break with the mirror of Prince's tradition that had counseled rulers to cultivate moral virtue as the path to political success. Machiavelli did not deny that moral virtue was admirable in private life. He simply observed that in political life, conventional virtue often led to disaster, while strategic vice often led to success. This was not because political life inverted moral categories, but because politics involved collective action problems that individual morality could not solve. A prince who trusted everyone would be betrayed. A republic whose citizens were universally virtuous would still need laws because virtue alone could not coordinate behavior or resolve conflicts. Machiavelli's realism about human nature also informed his understanding of how political authority must be maintained. Leaders could not rely on gratitude, loyalty, or moral obligation to ensure obedience. These sentiments were too weak and unreliable. Instead, leaders needed to create situations where obedience served subjects' interests or where disobedience triggered consequences that subjects feared. This meant combining benefits that made leadership attractive with punishments that made rebellion dangerous. A wise prince gave his subjects reasons to support him, while also giving potential rebels reasons to fear the consequences of opposition. This instrumental view of political obligation rejected social contract theories that would later dominate liberal political philosophy. Machiavelli did not believe that political authority rested on consent, implicit promises, or rational agreement to cooperate. Political authority rested ultimately on force, the capacity to compel obedience through violence or its threat. Consent and legitimacy were important, not as foundations of authority, but as tools for making authority more stable and less costly to maintain. A prince who ruled with his subjects' affection needed less coercive apparatus than one who ruled through fear alone. But affection without capacity for coercion was insufficient for stable rule. The question of whether Machiavelli's pessimism was empirically accurate or merely a convenient assumption for his political analysis has been debated for centuries. Some readers find his observations about human selfishness and unreliability confirmed by experience and historical evidence. Others argue that he exaggerated human wickedness to justify his immoral political prescriptions. Still others suggest that his pessimistic assumptions were strategic. By assuming the worst about human nature, political institutions could be designed to function even when humans behaved badly, while also working well when humans rose above his pessimistic expectations. There is textual evidence for all of these interpretations. Sometimes Machiavelli wrote as if his observations about human nature were empirical generalizations based on historical study and personal experience. Other times, he seemed to adopt pessimistic assumptions methodologically as premises for political analysis rather than as descriptions of fixed human essence. Still other passages suggested that human nature was malleable, shaped by institutions and circumstances rather than fixed across time and place. Romans had displayed extraordinary civic virtue because Roman institutions cultivated it. Modern Italians lacked civic virtue because their institutions had allowed it to decay. This suggested that human nature had potential for both virtue and vice, with actual behavior determined by circumstances. This more nuanced view helps explain how Machiavelli could be both pessimistic about human nature and optimistic about political possibilities. Humans left to themselves tended towards selfishness and disorder. But properly designed institutions could channel selfish motives toward public goods, cultivate civic virtue, and enable collective achievements that individuals alone could never accomplish. The key was understanding human nature accurately enough to design institutions that worked with human motives rather than against them. Machiavelli's realism about human nature also extended to his analysis of political psychology, how humans perceived and responded to political authority. He understood that reputation often mattered more than reality, that appearances could be as effective as facts, and that manipulating perceptions was a crucial political skill. A prince needed to appear virtuous even when acting viciously, to seem strong even when weak, to project confidence even when anxious. This was not because deception was inherently valuable, but because political authority depended partly on subjects' perceptions and beliefs, which could be shaped through strategic communication. This attention to political psychology distinguished Machiavelli from philosophers who assumed that rational argument and evident truth would naturally command assent. Machiavelli understood that most people formed political judgments based on limited information, emotional responses, and crude heuristics, rather than careful reasoning. They evaluated leaders based on outcomes rather than intentions, on apparent strength rather than actual capability, and on immediate effects rather than long-term consequences. A politically effective leader needed to understand and exploit these psychological regularities rather than simply presenting rational arguments for his policies. The role of fear in Machiavelli's political psychology is particularly important. He argued that fear was more reliable than love for maintaining political authority, because fear depended on punishment that the prince controlled, while love depended on subjects' gratitude, which could evaporate when circumstances changed. Fear created predictable responses, while love created unstable emotional bonds. This was not an endorsement of terror for its own sake, but an observation about which incentives reliably influence behavior. Moderate fear that deterred rebellion without inspiring desperate resistance was ideal. Terror that made subjects desperate could provoke exactly the opposition it was meant to prevent. But Machiavelli also understood that excessive reliance on fear created political brittleness. A leader who ruled purely through terror made enemies who would unite against him at the first opportunity. He created incentives for conspiracy and rebellion because subjects had nothing to lose by opposing him. He needed constant vigilance and extensive security apparatus that diverted resources from more productive uses. Better to combine fear with affection, using benefits to gain support, while reserving punishment for those who actively threaten the state. This mixed strategy created stable authority without requiring either pure coercion or naive trust. Machiavelli's realism about human nature has influenced political thought far beyond his explicit followers. The American founder's constitutional design, with its checks and balances and assumptions about factional conflict, reflected Machiavellian realism about human motives. Hobbes's social contract theory, though different in many respects, shared Machiavelli's pessimism about human nature in the absence of political authority. Modern rational choice theory in political science adopts assumptions about self-interested behavior that echo Machiavellian themes. Even liberal political philosophy, despite its rhetorical emphasis on human rights and dignity, often implicitly assumes something like Machiavelli's realistic psychology when designing institutions. Yet this realism also creates moral problems. If we assume humans are fundamentally selfish and unreliable, do we not create self-fulfilling prophecies by designing institutions that reward selfish behavior? If political leadership requires manipulating perceptions and exploiting fears, does this not corrupt both leaders and citizens? If we abandon hope for moral improvement through reason and education, do we not surrender the highest human potentials? These questions suggest that Machiavellian realism, however politically useful, comes with moral costs that cannot be entirely eliminated. Underlying much of Machiavelli's political philosophy was a distinctive conception of what made political action worthwhile and political communities admirable. Unlike Christian philosophers who emphasize salvation or Epicurean philosophers who emphasize pleasure, Machiavelli celebrated glory and greatness. The reputation for extraordinary achievement that extended beyond one's lifetime and the creation of enduring institutions that testify to human capability. This emphasis on glory connected Machiavelli to classical rather than Christian values and helped explain why he counseled methods that conventional Christian morality condemned. If the highest human achievement was glorious accomplishment rather than moral virtue, then actions that served glory could be justified even when they violated conventional morality. Machiavelli's conception of glory was fundamentally aristocratic and competitive. Glory was not something everyone could achieve equally, but a limited good for which extraordinary individuals competed. Those who founded states, conquered territories, reformed institutions, or performed extraordinary deeds worthy of memory, achieved glory. Those who lived ordinary lives, pursuing private pleasures and comforts, however virtuous they might be in conventional terms, achieved nothing worth remembering. Glory required not just success, but extraordinary success that demonstrated superiority to one's contemporaries and inspired awe in future generations. This conception of glory emerged from classical sources, particularly Livy and Plutarch, whose works described great men whose achievements earned them eternal fame. Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus exemplified founders whose glory rested on establishing nations and giving them laws. Caesar, Alexander, and Scipio exemplified military commanders whose conquests expanded the territories of their states. Solon and Lycurgus exemplified legislators whose constitutional reforms shaped political communities for generations. These were the models Machiavelli celebrated and encouraged contemporary leaders to emulate. But glory required not merely achievement but recognition. A prince who unified Italy but remained unknown would not achieve glory. Glory was essentially reputational fame for accomplishment that spread through space and endured through time. This made glory partly dependent on how one's actions were perceived and remembered, which in turn meant that controlling narrative and managing reputation were crucial political skills. A leader needed both to accomplish great things and to ensure that his accomplishments were properly recognized and celebrated. This helps explain Machiavelli's emphasis on the importance of appearances and his counsel that princes should carefully manage how they were perceived. The pursuit of glory also helped explain why Machiavelli counseled methods that conventional morality condemned. If glory was the highest good, and if conventional moral virtue did not reliably lead to glorious accomplishment, then violating conventional morality could be justified when necessary for achieving glory. A founder who massacred rivals but created a stable state achieved greater glory than a conventionally virtuous prince who lost his state to conquest. A military commander who won battles through deception achieved greater glory than an honest commander whose honesty led to defeat. The pursuit of glory created its own moral framework that sometimes contradicted conventional ethics. Yet, Machiavelli did not believe that any action could be justified in pursuit of glory. He distinguished between glory achieved through genuine accomplishment, serving the public good, and mere reputation achieved through spectacle or propaganda. He contrasted Caesar's questionable glory, built on destroying the Roman Republic, with Romulus's legitimate glory built on founding it. He distinguished Agathocles' success from true glory, because Agathocles' methods were too criminal to deserve admiration. This suggested that glory had moral constraints, even if it was not identical to conventional virtue. Actions that served no purpose beyond personal aggrandizement, that destroyed more than they created, or that were gratuitously cruel rather than strategically necessary, could not earn genuine glory, even if they achieved fame. The concept of greatness was closely related to glory, but focused more on the quality of institutions and collective achievements than on individual reputation. A great state was one that achieved power, stability, and duration that set it apart from ordinary political communities. Rome was great, not merely because of great individuals, but because Roman institutions enabled collective accomplishments over centuries. Sparta was great because its constitutional order created military excellence and political stability. Athens was great because it produced extraordinary cultural achievements. Greatness was both a cause and a consequence of glory. Great states enabled individuals to achieve glorious deeds, while glorious individuals created institutions that enabled states to become great. Machiavelli's emphasis on greatness had important implications for how political communities should be evaluated. He did not primarily judge states by how well they served their citizens' material welfare or protected individual rights. These modern liberal standards would have seemed inadequate to Machiavelli. Instead, he evaluated states by their power, their capacity to defend their independence, their ability to expand and project influence, and their production of glorious achievements in military, political, and cultural domains. A wealthy state that could not defend itself was contemptible. A politically free state that produced nothing memorable was insignificant. Greatness required both power and achievement. This evaluative framework connected to Machiavelli's understanding of what made human existence worthwhile. Life's meaning came not from private happiness, spiritual salvation, or philosophical contemplation, but from participation in great collective enterprises and the creation of enduring achievements. To contribute to one state's greatness, to help defend or expand its power, to participate in memorable events worthy of historical recording. These were what gave life significance. Conversely, to live passively accepting others' domination, to pursue only private pleasures while neglecting public service, or to exist without leaving any mark on history, was to waste human potential. This conception of meaningful existence was deeply political in ways that distinguish Machiavelli from both ancient philosophers and Christian theologians. Ancient philosophers often argued that political life was inferior to philosophical contemplation. Christianity taught that earthly political achievements were insignificant compared to spiritual salvation. But Machiavelli insisted that political action, particularly founding, reforming, and defending states, represented humanity's highest calling. This was not merely an empirical claim about what humans actually valued, but a normative argument about what they should value. The pursuit of glory and greatness also had dark implications that Machiavelli recognized but did not fully resolve. If glory required extraordinary achievement that set individuals apart from ordinary people, did this not encourage reckless ambition that destabilized political communities? If greatness required power and expansion, did this not justify aggressive wars that brought suffering to conquered populations? If the highest good was memorable achievement rather than moral virtue, did this not license any atrocity that happened to succeed spectacularly? These questions raise moral problems with Machiavelli's value framework that he never fully addressed. Moreover, the emphasis on glory and greatness created tensions with republican values that Machiavelli also celebrated. Republics were supposed to serve the common good and protect civic freedom, but the pursuit of glory and greatness could undermine both these goals. Leaders pursuing personal glory might subvert republican institutions to achieve power. States pursuing greatness might sacrifice citizens' welfare and freedom to military expansion. The Roman Republic eventually collapsed, partly because ambitious individuals like Caesar pursued personal glory in ways that destroyed republican liberty. This suggested that glory and republican freedom might sometimes conflict rather than coincide. Machiavelli attempted to reconcile these tensions by arguing that properly ordered republics channeled individual ambition toward collective benefit. When individuals achieved glory through serving the republic, as Roman consuls gained fame through military victories on behalf of Rome, personal ambition served public good. When states achieved greatness while maintaining republican institutions, as Rome expanded while preserving citizen armies and popular participation, collective power reinforced civic freedom. The key was institutional design that made glory achievable only through serving the republic rather than subverting it. But this reconciliation remained incomplete. The same ambition that could serve republics could also destroy them. The same expansion that demonstrated greatness could corrupt civic virtue. The same glory that motivated heroic service could inspire tyrannical seizure of power. Machiavelli recognized these dangers, but believed they were inevitable features of political life that had to be managed rather than eliminated. Politics necessarily involved risks because it required mobilizing human energies toward collective goals, and those energies could never be completely controlled or domesticated. The relationship between glory and fortune was also complicated. Fortune could destroy glorious achievements and elevate mediocrities to fame. The greatest virtues sometimes failed, while lesser capabilities sometimes succeeded through lucky circumstances. This meant that glory was not perfectly correlated with merit. Yet Machiavelli insisted that genuine glory required virtues, even when fortune also played a role. Those who achieve great things through pure luck rather than capability might gain temporary fame, but would not earn enduring glory. Only achievements that demonstrated extraordinary capability, combined with favorable circumstances, deserve to be remembered and celebrated across generations. This framework for evaluating political life, emphasizing glory, greatness, memorable achievement, and enduring fame, distinguished Machiavelli sharply from modern liberal political philosophy. Liberalism typically evaluates political systems by how well they protect individual rights, promote material welfare, or enable personal autonomy. These standards would have seemed inadequate to Machiavelli, who believed that human existence found meaning through participation in great collective enterprises rather than through private satisfaction or security. This difference in ultimate values explains much of why modern readers often find Machiavelli both fascinating and troubling. His value framework is alien enough to challenge our assumptions, while sophisticated enough to resist easy dismissal. One of Machiavelli's most important contributions to political philosophy was his systematic critique of what he called imaginary republics and principalities, the idealized political communities described by philosophers that bore little resemblance to actually existing states. This critique targeted not only ancient philosophers like Plato, but also contemporary humanists who counseled princes to embody Christian virtues and pursue moral perfection. Against these idealistic visions, Machiavelli insisted on analyzing politics as it actually existed rather than as philosophers wished it to be. This methodological commitment to realism over idealism represented a fundamental break with prior political philosophy and established a new standard for political analysis. The target of Machiavelli's critique was the entire tradition of political philosophy that began with Plato's Republic. Plato had described an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings, who possessed perfect knowledge of the good and governed according to rational principles rather than base motives. This ideal city would embody justice in its perfect form, with each class performing its proper function and the whole organized according to eternal forms accessible through philosophical contemplation. But Plato acknowledged that this ideal city probably could not exist in reality. It was a model for understanding justice rather than a blueprint for actual government. Similarly, Thomas More's Utopia, Tommaso Campanella's City of the Sun, and other Renaissance works described imaginary perfect societies where private property was abolished, labor was organized rationally, and citizens lived virtuously without the vices that plagued actual political communities. These works were partly satirical, critiquing existing societies by contrasting them with impossible ideals. But they also reflected a philosophical tradition that believed the proper task of political philosophy was to describe ideal political orders rather than to analyze existing ones. Against this tradition, Machiavelli insisted that political philosophy should focus on the effectual truth of the matter rather than the imagination of it. He was not interested in how rulers should behave according to philosophical ideals, but in how they must behave to achieve and maintain power in the actual world. He wanted to understand what made some states successful and others failures, what enabled some leaders to maintain authority while others were overthrown, and what institutional arrangements promoted stability and greatness. These empirical questions required analyzing actual political history rather than constructing imaginary perfections. This methodological shift had profound implications. If political philosophy's task was to describe reality rather than prescribe ideals, then it needed to study history, observe contemporary politics, and generalize from actual experience rather than deducing political principles from abstract moral or metaphysical truths. Political analysis became an empirical discipline, studying how power actually operated rather than a normative discipline prescribing how it ought to operate. This did not mean abandoning evaluation. Machiavelli certainly judged some states better than others, and some leaders more praiseworthy than others. But evaluation followed from analysis of what actually succeeded or failed rather than from application of eternal moral principles. Machiavelli's critique of idealism focused particularly on the assumption that conventional moral virtue would lead to political success. Philosophers and theologians had long counseled rulers to be just, merciful, honest, and generous. They assumed that subjects would love virtuous rulers and that God would reward moral excellence with political success. But Machiavelli observed that history demonstrated the opposite. Rulers who practiced conventional virtues often lost their states, while rulers who violated those virtues often succeeded. A prince who kept all his promises would be betrayed by rivals who broke theirs strategically. A ruler who refused to employ violence would be overthrown by those willing to use it. A state that conducted foreign policy according to moral principles would be conquered by states that prioritized power and advantage. These observations forced a reconceptualization of political virtue. If conventional moral virtue did not reliably produce political success, then political leaders needed different virtues, what Machiavelli called virtue. These political virtues included decisiveness, strategic thinking, capacity for violence when necessary, ability to dissemble, and willingness to violate conventional morality when circumstances required. A politically virtuous leader was one who successfully maintained his state and achieved glory, regardless of whether his methods conformed to conventional moral standards. This critique of moral idealism extended beyond advice to princes to encompass analysis of political institutions. Medieval and Renaissance political philosophy often described ideal constitutional arrangements that would produce just rule and political harmony. These idealized constitutions assumed that well-designed institutions could channel human behavior toward cooperative and virtuous outcomes. But Machiavelli argued that institutional design had to begin with realistic assumptions about human nature. If humans were selfish and unreliable, institutions could not assume virtuous behavior, but needed to create incentives that made selfish individuals serve collective goods despite their motives. This meant that republican institutions, for example, should not try to eliminate factional conflict, but should channel it productively. The Roman constitutions succeeded not by creating harmony, but by institutionalizing conflict between plebeians and patricians in ways that forced compromise and prevented either group from dominating. This was far from Plato's ideal city, where harmony prevailed because each person performed their natural function. It was effective institutional design based on realistic assessment of human motives and social conflicts. Machiavelli's critique of idealism also targeted religious moralism, the assumption that Christian ethics should govern political behavior. Religious thinkers counseled princes to turn the other cheek, to forgive enemies, to trust in divine providence, and to prioritize spiritual over worldly goods. But Machiavelli observed that following this advice led to political disaster. Christian princes who forgave enemies repeatedly were betrayed repeatedly. States that trusted in divine providence rather than military preparation were conquered. Leaders who prioritized spiritual goods over worldly success lost both their states and their ability to serve any spiritual purposes. This did not mean that religious morality had no place in human life. Machiavelli distinguished between private morality, appropriate for individuals, and political morality, appropriate for leaders bearing responsibility for entire communities. As private individuals, people could afford to forgive injuries, trust in providence, and prioritize spiritual over worldly goods, because their choices affected primarily themselves. But political leaders whose decisions affected thousands or millions of people could not afford such luxury. Their primary obligation was to preserve and strengthen their states, and this obligation sometimes required actions that violated individual moral principles. The distinction between is and ought, between how things actually are and how they ought to be, was central to Machiavelli's critique of idealism. Traditional political philosophy had often conflated these categories, assuming that describing the ideal was sufficient for understanding politics. But Machiavelli insisted on their separation. Political analysis needed to begin with careful observation of how things actually worked, rather than with prescriptions about how they ought to work. Only after understanding political reality could one make realistic recommendations about achievable improvements. This methodological commitment to realism had enormous influence on subsequent political thought. Hobbes would begin his political analysis with a realistic description of human nature in the state of nature, rather than with idealized visions of rational cooperation. Machiavelli's empirical approach, studying history, observing contemporary politics, generalizing from actual experience, became standard methodology for political science. Even normative political philosophy increasingly accepted the need to ground ideals in realistic assessments of human nature and institutional possibilities. Yet Machiavelli's critique of idealism created its own problems. If political philosophy abandons prescription for description, does it not become merely technical advice about power acquisition with no moral content? If we reject ideals as unrealistic, do we not surrender the critical function of political philosophy? Its capacity to judge existing arrangements and imagine better alternatives. If we accept political reality as given rather than subject to transformation, do we not become merely apologists for whatever power structure happens to exist? These concerns have legitimacy, but Machiavelli had partial answers. He did not abandon evaluation, but relocated it. Instead of judging states by conformity to abstract ideals, he evaluated them by success in achieving security, stability, expansion, and glory. These criteria were still normative. They distinguished better from worse political communities, but they were grounded in political rather than moral or metaphysical standards. A good state was one that defended its independence, maintained internal order, produced great achievements, and earned enduring fame. These goals were not arbitrary, but reflected what made political communities worth creating and maintaining. Moreover, Machiavelli's realism did not preclude political reform or improvement. He believed that understanding how politics actually worked enabled more effective reform than idealistic prescriptions that ignored political reality. A reformer who understood human selfishness could design institutions that channeled selfish motives toward public goods. A leader who recognized that fear was more reliable than love could use fear strategically to create stable authority. Understanding political reality was the prerequisite for changing it effectively, rather than merely imagining impossible transformations. The tension between Machiavellian realism and political idealism remains unresolved in contemporary political philosophy. Liberal political theorists continue to describe ideal political arrangements based on human rights, justice, equality, while acknowledging that actual states fall far short of these ideals. Realist international relations theorists analyze how states actually behave, while sometimes being accused of legitimizing amoral power politics. The question of whether political philosophy should primarily describe reality or prescribe ideals, and how to relate empirical analysis to normative evaluation, continues to divide political thinkers much as it did in Machiavelli's time. Among Machiavelli's most psychologically penetrating analyses is his extended treatment of conspiracies against princes and republics. This might seem like a narrow technical topic, but Machiavelli's discussion illuminates fundamental issues about political authority, trust, and the precariousness of power. His analysis reveals how even seemingly secure rulers face constant threats from ambitious subordinates, disgruntled subjects, and foreign enemies. Understanding conspiracies was essential for political leaders who needed to detect and prevent plots against their authority while avoiding the paranoia that could destroy effective governance. Machiavelli devoted an entire chapter of the Discourses to conspiracies, demonstrating through historical examples how difficult they were to execute successfully, but also how frequently they were attempted. The difficulty arose from the multiple stages at which conspiracies could fail: during planning, during execution, or during the aftermath. At each stage, conspirators faced dangers that made success unlikely. Yet the frequency of attempts testified to the constant temptation that power created for those close enough to seize it. The planning stage was particularly dangerous for conspirators. Any plot required multiple participants, but each additional conspirator increased the risk of betrayal. Someone might reveal the plot to gain favor with the ruler. Someone might develop cold feet as the danger became real. Someone might prove incompetent or unreliable when action was required. The difficulty of finding capable conspirators who could be trusted completely made most plots fail before they were attempted. Moreover, the prince's security forces were always watching for signs of conspiracy, interrogating suspects, and encouraging betrayal through rewards for informers. Even if planning succeeded, execution presented additional dangers. The conspirators needed to get close enough to the prince to act while avoiding his guards and surveillance. They needed to coordinate their actions precisely because any hesitation or delay could allow the prince to escape or summon help. They needed courage to strike when the moment came, but many conspirators lost their nerve when faced with actual violence against legitimate authority. Historical examples demonstrated repeatedly how conspiracies failed at the moment of execution, because someone hesitated, someone was stopped by guards, or someone's weapon failed. But even successful assassination did not guarantee success for conspirators. They still needed to seize control of the state, eliminate the prince's supporters, and establish their own authority. This often proved impossible, because the prince's death created chaos that competitors exploited, because the prince's supporters mobilized against the assassins, or because foreign powers intervened to restore the previous dynasty or install their own candidates. Many successful assassinations led only to civil war or foreign conquest rather than to the conspirators' elevation to power. These observations led Machiavelli to conclude that conspiracies rarely succeeded, and that plotting against princes was extraordinarily dangerous for conspirators. Yet they continued to occur because ambition overcame prudence, because desperate subjects saw no alternative to violence, or because plotters overestimated their capabilities and underestimated the difficulties they faced. Understanding why conspiracies usually failed could help princes take measures to prevent them, while also helping potential conspirators recognize the folly of attempting plots. For princes seeking to prevent conspiracies, Machiavelli offered several recommendations. First, avoid being hated by your subjects. A widely hated prince faced constant conspiracy attempts because many subjects had motives to remove him. But a prince who maintained popular support faced far fewer threats because conspirators could not recruit widely and risk popular opposition if they succeeded. Second, keep potential conspirators divided and suspicious of each other. If possible rivals trusted each other, they might coordinate against the prince, but if they suspected and spied on each other, conspiracy became almost impossible. Third, employ informers and intelligence networks to detect plots early. Most conspiracies could be uncovered before execution if the prince maintained effective surveillance. Fourth, remove or neutralize particularly dangerous individuals before they became centers of conspiracy. But Machiavelli also warned against excessive suspicion that could itself undermine authority. A prince who trusted no one, who constantly feared conspiracy, and who executed suspected plotters on flimsy evidence would generate the very hatred that made conspiracy likely. The challenge was to remain vigilant without becoming paranoid, to take threats seriously without seeing threats everywhere, and to act against genuine conspirators without creating martyrs or terrorizing loyal subjects. This required judgment that balanced security concerns against the political costs of excessive suspicion. The analysis of conspiracy also revealed deeper truths about the nature of political power. Authority was inherently precarious because it depended on continuous relationships of trust and fear with subjects who had their own interests and ambitions. A prince needed subordinates to govern effectively, but those same subordinates possessed knowledge, access, and capability that made them potential threats. Creating security required constant attention to managing these relationships, detecting threatening combinations, and preventing potential conspirators from developing both motive and opportunity. This precariousness explained why Machiavelli counseled princes to combine cruelty with mercy, fear with affection, and generosity with parsimony. Excessive cruelty made the prince hated and increased conspiracy attempts. But excessive mercy made him appear weak and encouraged ambitious subjects to test his resolve. The key was strategic variation, appearing capable of ruthlessness when necessary, but actually employing it sparingly, generating enough fear to deter conspiracy, but not so much fear that desperate subjects saw no alternative to violence. The problem of conspiracy also highlighted the advantages of republican over princely government. In republics, power was distributed among many citizens rather than concentrated in a single ruler. This made conspiracy less attractive because eliminating one leader did not give conspirators control of the state. It also made conspiracy less necessary because dissatisfied citizens could pursue their interests through regular political channels rather than resorting to violence. Republican institutions provided mechanisms for peaceful leadership change that reduced incentives for conspiracy, while also making successful conspiracies less destabilizing. Yet republics faced their own conspiracy problems. Ambitious citizens might conspire to overthrow republican institutions and establish personal power. Foreign enemies might conspire with internal factions to subvert the republic. Conspiracies against individual leaders might destabilize the republic even when targeting justifiably unpopular officials. Rome experienced repeated conspiracies throughout its history and, some like Caesar's, eventually destroyed republican government. So republican institutions reduced, but did not eliminate conspiracy as a political threat. Machiavelli's analysis of conspiracy also revealed his understanding of human psychology under conditions of danger and temptation. He recognized that people behaved very differently when planning violence than when executing it. Abstract conspiracy seemed attractive when discussed safely, but actually killing someone required psychological fortitude that most people lacked. The gap between intention and action explained why so many conspiracies failed at the moment of execution. Conspirators discovered they could not overcome inhibitions against violence, loyalty to authority, or fear of consequences. This psychological realism extended to understanding why people betrayed conspiracies. Betrayal often resulted not from moral scruples, but from calculation that revealing the plot was safer than participating in it. A conspirator who doubted the plot's success could avoid danger by exposing it and gaining the prince's gratitude. Someone who feared being betrayed by co-conspirators might betray first to avoid being implicated. The psychology of betrayal involved complex calculations about relative risks and benefits that made conspiracy unstable, even when all participants initially shared commitment to the plot. The treatment of conspiracy demonstrated Machiavelli's methodology at its finest. He combined systematic analysis of structural factors with attention to psychological dynamics. He drew on extensive historical examples to identify patterns while recognizing that particular circumstances made each case unique. He extracted practical lessons for both princes, fearing conspiracy, and potential conspirators contemplating plots. He connected a seemingly narrow topic to broader questions about authority, legitimacy, and the fragility of political power. This made his analysis of conspiracy simultaneously practical advice and profound political philosophy. The reception of Machiavelli's work represents one of the most fascinating chapters in intellectual history. Almost immediately after The Prince and the Discourses, his game began circulating. Machiavellian became synonymous with cunning, deceit, and a moral pursuit of power. The Catholic Church placed his works on the index of prohibited books. Protestant reformers denounced him as an agent of the Antichrist. Political philosophers across Europe condemned him as a teacher of evil. Even those who covertly applied his insights publicly repudiated his name. For centuries, no respectable thinker would openly embrace Machiavellian principles, even while many secretly studied his works and applied his lessons. This hostile reception partly reflected genuine horror at Machiavelli's explicit prescriptions. His advice that princes should learn how not to be good, that they should employ cruelty strategically, that they should break promises when advantageous, and that they should manipulate religious belief for political purposes, shocked readers accustomed to political philosophy that counseled moral virtue and religious devotion. The matter-of-fact tone with which Machiavelli discussed actions that conventional morality condemned made his work particularly disturbing. He did not even pretend to anguish over ethical dilemmas or to seek moral justification for his prescriptions. He simply analyzed what worked. But the hostile reception also reflected deliberate misreading and strategic denunciation. Many of Machiavelli's critics had actually read his works carefully and learned from them, even while publicly condemning them. The denunciation of Machiavellianism became a way for political actors to signal their own moral purity, while covertly applying the very principles they ostensibly rejected. Accusing one's opponents of Machiavellianism became a standard rhetorical move that obscured the fact that most successful political leaders, regardless of their public pronouncements, understood and applied the realities that Machiavelli had described. This created a peculiar situation. Machiavelli became perhaps the most influential political philosopher in European history, despite being universally denounced. His insights about power, human nature, military organization, and political institutions shaped actual political practice even while his name symbolized everything respectable thought should reject. The term Machiavellian became detached from Machiavelli's actual teachings and came to represent a crude caricature of amoral power politics that Machiavelli's nuanced analysis transcended. Part of what made Machiavelli so influential was that he addressed questions that traditional political philosophy had avoided or answered inadequately. How could political communities survive in a dangerous world where their neighbors obeyed no moral constraints? What should leaders do when moral requirements conflicted with political necessities? How could states defend freedom against external threats and internal tyranny? What made some leaders successful and others failures, despite similar moral qualities? These practical questions admitted no easy answers from traditional philosophy. But Machiavelli's analysis provided guidance grounded in historical experience and realistic assessment of human nature. The influence of Machiavellian ideas appeared in multiple domains. In international relations, the concept of raison d'etat, the principle that state survival and security justified actions that would be immoral for individuals, reflected Machiavellian logic, even when explicitly distinguished from Machiavellianism. Cardinal Richelieu's conduct of French foreign policy, with its pragmatic alliances and disregard for religious solidarity when state interests required, embodied Machiavellian principles. The entire realist tradition in international relations theory, from Hobbes through Morgenthau to contemporary theorists, developed insights that Machiavelli had pioneered. In constitutional design, the American founder's sophisticated understanding of how to structure institutions to control faction and ambition reflected Machiavellian realism about human nature, even though they rarely cited him explicitly. The Federalist Papers' famous observation that if men were angels, no government would be necessary, echoed Machiavellian insights about human unreliability. The elaborate system of checks and balances, designed to make ambition counteract ambition, applied Machiavellian principles about channeling selfish motives toward public goods. In military affairs, the gradual replacement of mercenary armies with national forces reflected recognition of Machiavelli's arguments about citizen soldiers' superior reliability. The emphasis on military preparedness, the understanding that peace required military strength, and the rejection of utopian hopes for perpetual peace all reflected Machiavellian influence. Modern military education, with its emphasis on studying historical campaigns and learning from both successes and failures, embodied Machiavellian methodology. Yet, Machiavelli's legacy also included critics who grappled seriously with his arguments rather than merely denouncing them. Some, like Jean Bodin, accepted Machiavellian realism about power, while trying to reconstruct moral constraints on sovereignty. Others, like Montesquieu, built on Machiavellian insights about institutional design, while rejecting his apparent indifference to individual rights. Still others, like Rousseau, acknowledged the force of Machiavellian analysis, while insisting that political communities required moral transformation, rather than merely clever institutional engineering. The Enlightenment produced more openly positive assessments of Machiavelli. Spinoza defended him as a friend of liberty who had revealed how tyrants operate so that free peoples could resist them. Hume praised his historical method and empirical approach. Diderot's encyclopedia presented sympathetic readings of his works. This rehabilitation suggested that as Europe became more secular and as realistic power politics became more openly acknowledged, Machiavelli's explicit analysis of political reality could be appreciated rather than merely condemned. The 19th century saw continuing debate about Machiavelli's significance. German historians and philosophers engaged intensely with his thought, seeing him as a crucial figure in the transition from medieval to modern political consciousness. Hegel interpreted him as expressing the spirit of Italian nationalism and the necessity of political unification. Historians debated whether Machiavelli was fundamentally Republican or a theorist of princely power, whether he represented Italian particularism or universal political science, and whether his apparent amoralism was genuine or strategic. The 20th century produced scholarly rehabilitation of Machiavelli, alongside continuing popular use of Machiavellian as a term of abuse. Academic political theorists recognized him as a founder of modern political science, an important Republican thinker, and a sophisticated analyst of institutional design. His realism about power, his attention to unintended consequences, and his recognition that political ethics might differ from private morality, all seemed vindicated by the catastrophic experiences of 2 world wars, totalitarianism, and persistent international conflict. Yet the 20th century also produced disturbing appropriations of Machiavellian thought. Fascist and totalitarian leaders invoked his authority to justify ruthless policies. Mussolini wrote approvingly of Machiavelli's emphasis on power and his rejection of conventional morality. This association with fascism further complicated Machiavelli's reputation and led to renewed debate about whether his philosophy contained proto-totalitarian elements or whether fascists had simply misappropriated a republican thinker for their own purposes. Contemporary political theory continues to debate Machiavelli's significance and legacy. Some scholars emphasize his republicanism and treat him as an important theorist of civic virtue and political freedom. Others focus on his realism and see him as a precursor to modern international relations theory. Still others explore his critique of Christianity and his role in secularizing political thought. Feminist scholars have criticized his patriarchal assumptions and his use of misogynistic metaphors. Each generation finds new dimensions of Machiavelli's thought to explore and new contemporary relevance in his analysis. The question of whether Machiavelli's teachings are dangerous remains contested. Critics argue that his explicit separation of politics from conventional morality licenses atrocities and undermines the moral constraints necessary for civilized political life. The history of political violence, from Renaissance Italy through 20th century totalitarianism, seems to vindicate concerns that Machiavellian immoralism produces catastrophic results. The casual way he discusses massacre, betrayal, and manipulation seems to normalize evil rather than merely analyzing it. Defenders respond that Machiavelli did not create political immorality, but honestly described realities that euphemistic political philosophy had obscured. Political leaders have always employed violence, deception, and ruthlessness when they believed circumstances required it. Machiavelli's contribution was to analyze these practices systematically rather than pretending they did not exist or condemning them without understanding why they occurred. Moreover, his analysis contained moral standards, even if not conventional ones. He distinguished cruelty well used from cruelty badly used, legitimate from illegitimate pursuits of power, and actions serving the common good from those serving only private ambition. The contemporary relevance of Machiavelli's thought remains striking. In an era of renewed great power competition, resurgent authoritarianism, and continued military conflict, his realism about power and his skepticism about moral constraints in international affairs seem vindicated. In democracies facing internal polarization and external threats, his analysis of how republics decay and how they might be renewed remains pertinent. In a world where political leaders routinely employ deception, where populist movements exploit democratic procedures to undermine democratic norms, and where traditional authorities have lost credibility, Machiavellian insights about political psychology and institutional fragility illuminate contemporary challenges. Yet applying Machiavellian principles in contemporary contexts requires careful attention to changed circumstances. Modern states differ fundamentally from Renaissance Italian city-states. Democratic legitimacy rests on different foundations than princely authority. Modern military technology, global economic integration, and international institutions create constraints and opportunities that Machiavelli could not have anticipated. The challenge is to learn from Machiavelli's methods, his realism, his attention to power, his historical approach, his institutional analysis, without simply transposing his specific prescriptions to radically different contexts. The ultimate significance of Machiavelli lies not in particular prescriptions, but in his transformation of how politics could be understood and analyzed. He established that political phenomena could be studied empirically, that human nature set constraints on political possibilities, that institutions required design based on realistic rather than idealistic assumptions, and that political success required different virtues than private morality. These methodological contributions transcend particular historical contexts and continue to shape how we think about politics. Yet Machiavelli also bequeathed unresolved tensions that continue to haunt political thought. The relationship between power and morality, between effectiveness and legitimacy, between realistic assessment and normative evaluation remains contested. Whether political leaders can pursue just ends through unjust means without corrupting both themselves and their causes remains uncertain. Whether democracies can survive while maintaining the moral constraints that help define them as democratic remains an open question. Whether international order can be maintained without either utopian hopes for perpetual peace or cynical acceptance of perpetual war remains unclear. These enduring questions ensure that Machiavelli remains not merely a historical figure, but a living presence in political philosophy. His name continues to provoke strong reactions precisely because the issues he raised admit no easy resolution. 5 centuries after he wrote, we are still grappling with the fundamental problems he identified: how to combine realism with idealism, power with principle, effectiveness with morality, and survival with justice. His legacy is not a set of answers, but a set of questions that every generation must confront anew.